Chapter 17 of Angel Food Time, Little Talks to Little Folks by Rev. Gerald T. Brennan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 17 A Bag of Gold Marbles. When I was a boy, I didn't spend my nights listening to the radio or watching television. There was no such thing as radio in those days, and there was no television. But just the same we had fun at our house. We played games and read books, and Sunday night was always story night. That was the night when my father always told one of his famous stories. Maybe you would like to hear one of those stories, the story about Terry and the bag of gold marbles. Terry O'Donnell was a little Irish boy, and like all boys who lived in Ireland, he believed in giants and fairies and little men who lived under the ground. But Terry O'Donnell had never seen a giant. He had never seen a fairy. He had never seen one of the little men of Ireland. No, not until that summer day when Terry went fishing. That day Terry had the surprise of his life. Terry fished all morning and caught nothing. He was tired and disgusted and started for home. The boy had gone only a little way when he heard someone call his name. Terry stopped, looked around, but could see no one. "Where are you?" called Terry at the top of his voice. There was no answer at first. Then a tiny little man jumped out from behind a bush. When Terry saw the little fellow, his eyes almost popped out of his head. The tiny little man was only about 2 feet tall. He was real, though, and very much alive. "Do you live under the ground?" Terry asked excitedly. The tiny little man smiled and nodded his head. "Yes," he answered, "I live under the ground. Would you like to see my home?" Terry didn't have to be asked a second time. Certainly he wanted to see the little man's home. Terry thought that would be lots of fun. Terry followed the tiny little man through the woods. Now maybe you think that Terry was afraid. Well, Terry wasn't afraid because he was curious. Suddenly the tiny man stopped walking. He stooped down and picked up a small red stone, and hidden under the stone was a shining button. The little man pushed the button, and guess what happened? A large piece of earth opened up just like a door. By this time Terry wondered whether it was all a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Terry was wide awake. Terry followed the little man down a long stairway. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the little man pushed another button, and the door at the top of the stairs closed. Was it dark down under the earth? Not at all. It was almost as bright as day, because the one large room was lighted by lanterns, candles, and colored lights. There were tiny tables and tiny chairs, tiny beds, and a tiny stove. Everything in the room was small, and all the people were small. Why, there must have been 20 tiny people living in that great big room, and they were all very happy. The tiny people were pleased because Terry had come to visit them. Of course, the tiny little people prepared a meal for Terry, and what a grand meal it was! Terry was hungry and he enjoyed the good food. Oh, how he laughed at the funny stories told by the strange little men! He liked their songs, too. Yes, Terry O'Donnell had a grand time. It was all so different. After dinner the tiny little men washed the dishes, and they wouldn't let Terry help. So Terry walked around the large room and looked at the many strange things. A tiny piano, a small bicycle, and there was one thing, especially, that caught Terry's eye. It was a small bag of gold marbles. When Terry saw those marbles, he wanted them. Yes, Terry wanted those marbles for himself. So what do you think? Terry took the bag of gold marbles from the shelf and put the bag in his pocket. When the tiny little men finished their work, they played the piano and sang songs. They played a few games and told more stories. They were certainly nice people who tried hard to please their new friend. But Terry was worried. Terry was ashamed. The tiny little men had been good to Terry, but he had stolen their bag of gold marbles. Finally, Terry decided to go home. He thanked the tiny little men and they followed him to the door. Terry waved his hand and started through the woods. When the boy was out of sight, he took the bag of marbles from his pocket and opened it. Boy, they were beautiful marbles, the finest marbles Terry had ever seen. He closed the bag and, holding the bag in his hand, started to run. But just as Terry ran into his yard, he stumbled, fell, and dropped the bag of precious marbles. And what do you think? Before Terry could pick himself up, one of the tiny little men grabbed the bag of marbles and hurried away. Yes, he had seen Terry steal the marbles and had followed him. Terry O'Donnell was just like so many boys and girls. His eyes were too big. Those marbles didn't belong to Terry, and he had no right to touch them. He took something that didn't belong to him. When Terry stole those marbles, he thought that no one saw him. But one of the tiny little men saw everything, and I'm mighty glad that the little man got back his bag of gold marbles. Boys and girls, you have no right to touch anything that doesn't belong to you. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, you steal, and stealing is a sin. When you steal, you may think that no one sees you, but don't forget that God sees you. And another thing, whenever you steal, it is not enough to tell the sin of stealing in confession. You must do something more. You must always give back the thing that was stolen. If you don't give back the stolen thing or make up for it in some way, your sin will not be forgiven. Children, be satisfied with what God has given you. If you want something, ask your parents for it. And if Mother and Dad say no, then go without it. If little Terry had asked for the gold marbles, maybe the little men would have given them to him. Don't be like Terry O'Donnell. Don't steal. God bless you and take good care of yourself. End of chapter 17.